Sorry, I think I did something with... Oh, here it is. Perfect. Good morning, everyone. Hi. Delighted to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. Here it is, the colorful first slide, mandatory for a talk on creativity. Here we go. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm very happy to talk to you about something that I'm really passionate about. I think we all share this passion. That's why we're here. And very happy to see also the theme of the conference this year, which not only has creativity in the title, but another word that has been obsessing me for about 6-7 years now, which is possibility. So at DCU, we have a Center for Possibility Studies, and there is also a network that I'm going to tell you just a little bit about later. So my plan for today is to start you off from the possible. I think that is a very good starting point for us. Then I'm going to take you on a little kind of historical journey around how we think about creativity, and I promise it will pay off and will tell us something about the world of today and how we look at creativity, including our own creativity today. We're going to talk about the creative process. Now, we could talk for 2 weeks about the creative process. I'm going to give you a kind of a version, my way of understanding the creative process. And then I'm going to make the connections that I think we all think about between creativity, diversity, and care, which are actually fundamental for the way I've been thinking about creativity and the creative process for a long time. And I did not include that as a slide just because of this conference, I promise you. They've always been there. At the end, I want to leave you with some kind of practical tips. I'm not going to talk a lot about very concrete tools, but more about principles that we can use to foster creativity and possibility thinking. And I'm going to end with an invitation. So hopefully this plan works for you. It's kind of late to change it now. So my own point of departure and why I became interested in creativity. So I'm a psychologist. I'm a social psychologist by training. And what fascinates me most about our existence as human beings is that we have what I tend to call an amphibious way of living, right? We're in two places at the same time. We're actually more places at the same time. We're in the here and now. We're physically located, we look around, we feel and sense other people, but at the same time, we are effectively in other places as well, right? We remember things and kind of travel to the past. We imagine futures. We might be thinking, what is there for lunch? I know that's often one of my questions. We also think about alternatives to what could be, and we engage in what in psychology we call as if, what if only, what else type of thinking processes. So we live these amphibious lives between the here and now and other dimensions that are virtual, possible, potential, and that actually enrich and expand our experience of the here and now, effectively transform it. So a lot of my work actually has to do with creativity per se, with possibility thinking, but the kind of things I would be looking at are these types of processes. So what is fundamental. And I just want to say this from the start, that just as it has been mentioned, creativity is related deeply with constraints, possibility is related to what is, to reality, to actuality, right? So this is not a call to leave behind the realm of reality. Actually, it is all about reality, because it is in this reality that we get to do things and think differently and transform them. So how do we do that? Well, connecting to what is, we think about what could be. We think about alternatives. We think about possible solutions. We pretend things are different. I mean, anyone who has seen a child playing, you know that they actually might not need the fanciest toys. They need the simplest object in the house, and then they're going to take that and transform it and act as if it was something else. So what could be is a huge engine of creative thought. What is to come, the domain of the future, is another area that is absolutely crucial for possibility thinking, because a lot of what is possible is in the future. And part of all of our work, whatever we do, but I think social care, obviously in particular, is to anticipate, to think about the short term, the medium term, the long term, and also to imagine things that could be, including wilder fantasies. How else can we change reality or improve it if we don't give ourselves the chance to kind of radically think about a different future? Another part of possibility thinking has to do with the past, actually. A lot of people think about the past as something that happened, it's there. Of course, nowadays with post-truth and all sorts of debates, there are big questions around that as well, and some of them quite dark. But what I'm talking about with might have happened here is counterfactual thinking. So in psychology, we have a long line of research looking at how rethinking the past, reimagining, a good event that might not have happened, or a bad event that we might have avoided, has a huge consequence for our mood, for how we feel, but also for what we learn from the past. So this is, again, a big resource for creative thinking and innovation. And last but not least is the domain of what can never be. Right? We engage with what is yet to come, but there are things that might never come. You know, the area of the impossible, which is very intimately connected, again, to how we create in general. We have this ability not only to be able to take a bit of distance from the here and now, but to explore areas that are, you know, out of reach for reality. And that kind of utopian thinking is a huge driver for some of the boldest type of creativity in many ways. So this is what I'm trying to look at. I'm trying to look at these processes that we engage in at every moment, whether we think about what might come next for lunch, or whether we think about how is a world possible, you know, beyond the climate crisis or beyond capitalism or all sorts of big questions. And I'm trying to do that in a way that is very interdisciplinary. And whenever I talk about possibility studies, I actually think of the metaphor of the forest. You know, I think of creativity as a big tree that has many, many branches, and if you want to find me, I'll be on the kind of the sociocultural branch. Anyway, there are many more. There is a neuroscience branch and you know, individual differences and so on. But this tree is not alone, actually. There are so many other communities of scholars, of practitioners who engage with these big questions around what else, what if, you know, what else is possible. So people who work on agency, on innovation, on imagination, on play, which is another big word for today, counterfactuals, you know, wonder, curiosity. We all share this interest in how we make people aware of new horizons of possibility and help them individually or collectively, especially collectively actually, enact them. So this is the kind of the core mission of possibility studies. And I will come back with an invitation for you at the end if I piqued your curiosity. Now, what is creativity? Well, creativity is many things to many people. Actually, it's a bit paradoxical that we offer a definition of creativity because we should potentially be more creative about it. But if you want to know in psychology, and I think this is quite a common definition across more disciplines, we think of creativity as two big things coming together. These are not novelty and originality. This is kind of one aspect of it. So what is the difference between something being new and something being original? I usually ask this in class and we have a chat, but you know, at the moment probably it works better if I tell you what I think about it, and I'd be very happy in the Q&A if you think differently. Something new means that it's been created now. It's kind of a temporal category, but something original is something that is different from what existed before. So some things can be new because we just, you know, make them now based on a mechanical reproduction system, but they wouldn't be necessarily original or different or surprising. So for something to be creative, there needs to be an element of surprise, if you want. It's something that intrigues us, that is quite different than what we usually know or what we expect. But this surprise is usually balanced by another criterion, which is appropriateness, meaningfulness, value. Something creative has value to us. Now, for many people, this is commercial value, financial value, and I'm sad to say that a lot of the hype around the discourses around creativity innovation come from the fact that people do think about these as engines of very capitalist, you know, neoliberal societies, but value can mean so much more. I mean, young children scribbling on paper or us engaging in a role-play exercise, there's not a financial value to that, but there is a lot of value in terms of human development, in terms of well-being. You know, creativity gives us that, and something that is appropriate means that it is meaningful for what we do, that it makes sense for us. So to create something means to bring about new, surprising things that are meaningful, important, and they help us in different ways. Now, that's not an easy task, actually, and a lot of research that works with people's ideas shows that these two criteria sometimes have a negative correlation. They're kind of negatively connected to each other, because very often things that are very surprising and very new, we don't fully know what to do with them, so they don't yet have an immediate value for us. And things that have an obvious value, they're very appropriate, they're very, they tend to be known. They really don't surprise us much. So producing things that are creative is not an easy task, and yet we do it every day. I would almost argue every moment. If you think about our stream of thinking, oftentimes we think new thoughts, and new thoughts that take us somewhere. So the unicorn is to be found. Of course, working on possibility studies, I would say that. But beyond just how we do this, I think there is another dimension to creativity that we need to be talking about much more, which is the idea of how we think about creativity. So creativity does require a set of skills and aptitudes, and people talk about, intelligence as being important, motivation as being important, and so on. But beyond that, there is a question of attitude. There is a question of how we approach problems. Whether we approach a problem and think, well, I could do something creative about this, or we approach it and think, well, let me fall back on the tried and tested. And this is what constitutes our creative identity, or lack of, or kind of problematic creative identity. One of my favorite questions, and again, I can't ask it now, but imagine that I did. If I had the chance, I definitely would, is, are you creative? And I love listening to people's explanations around that. And one of the very common answers that at least I find very often is, yeah, I am creative, but I don't produce big art or put things in museums, or I'm not Marie Curie. And it's very interesting to me as a creativity researcher and as a social psychologist why we have this double discourse, why we tend to kind of want to be creative, but because of the standard we set for these phenomena very often, we don't accept or embrace our creative identity. And the reason this is important, and because I'm a pragmatist at heart, I firmly believe in this, is that if we don't acknowledge or engage with our creative side, then we're not going to take advantage of all the opportunities to actually be creative. So it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So one of the big questions that we should have with ourselves, with the people we work with, the people we help, is how can we help them foster a creative self-understanding? How can we help them understand that within their everyday life, they produce so many novelties and so many meaningful things that should be observed, celebrated, understood, and then fostered more and more. So one of the big reasons why I think we don't, or people in general don't often embrace their creative identity, has to do with the history of how we think about creativity. And I promise I'm going to take you on a very quick historical trajectory. When I started my PhD, which was 15 years ago, anyway, some time ago, there was already a lot written on the topic of creativity. Today you have much, much more. So as a student, I thought, okay, how can I organize this big field into some of the bigger ideas? And what I came up with then, and I'm happy to share the resource if you want to read more, is the idea of 3 different main paradigms or ways of approaching creativity. And I called them at the time, and I kind of still stand by it, the he, the I, and the we paradigm. Now, the first one, and historically it's the first way in which we tended to think of creativity, in terms of divine inspiration and the figure of the genius, focuses us on these very special people we call geniuses in society. Now, just to say, the reason I use the word he or the person, third person, is first of all to acknowledge the fact that it is male creativity that has been historically recognized, so there is a big ideological bias very often when we think about geniuses. There is already a problematic aspect there. But also by using the third person is the distance we put between ourselves and this idea of geniuses. So of course, unless we have a very healthy self-esteem bordering sometimes on narcissism, I think most people would think, well, geniuses, they do their thing, and I'm doing my little creative thing over here. So the thing is, we can learn a lot from studying the life of geniuses, and I do recommend when you go next to an airport or wherever you find these airport books, to pick up a book about these big creators. I think that there is a lot of knowledge to be gained. But at the same time, I worry that if we think of creativity only in terms of the he paradigm, we put this artificial distance between ourselves and what it means to create. First of all, we adopt a very individualistic way of looking at creativity because the person of genius is the big focus. What makes them a genius? Do they have a different brain or a different brain functioning? Or do they have a very unique life experience? What puts them in that position? And we tend to forget to look around to understand the context of what makes someone labeled a genius. There is a lot of fascinating work in the sociology of genius, for example, that shows that very often, and without trying to take away anything of the kind of giftedness or special ability of people considered geniuses, but it is where they're placed in a network that makes a huge difference when it comes to them being recognized or producing work of genius. So I think we should, without throwing away the individual, we should question a bit this very individualistic way of thinking about creative people, that they have to be alone, they have to fight their society, their culture, their context. And the focus shouldn't be only on these, what's called the big C creativity, historical creations. We should accept and understand that preparing a meal or making a drawing, or just having a conversation where, you know, we use humor and we reach a new understanding is an act of creativity. And this doesn't fit with the he paradigm. So the problems with it, I would say, is first of all, it presents us with a very essentialist way of looking at creativity. We try to look at the essence. What is it that makes someone creative? And we try to find it within the person. And my big argument is that it's within relationships. It's not within the person in isolation. And the second thing is that it's quite exclusive. You know, it creates these barriers between who we think as geniuses and maybe ourselves. One of these cultural images that I often think of when I think of, and I don't want to blame Rodin, I mean, I don't think he thought of the he paradigm necessarily, but his thinker is such a powerful depiction to me of a big way of thinking about creative people, you know, male in this example, but also alone, isolated, deep in thought, as if when you create, you don't, use your body or talk to other people or engage with your environment. So this image, without throwing the baby in the bathwater in the tub with all of them, we do have a lot to learn from geniuses, but we have to be careful how we think about their creativity. Where does it come from? And actually, the second paradigm addresses some of these limitations, and I call it the I paradigm. And it is a discourse that I think you would be very familiar with. I think a lot of us, this is where society has taken us, the idea that each and every person has creative potential. If even they don't do something necessarily creative, they could do something creative. So this is what a lot of education is based on. This is a big way of democratizing creativity, but I would still argue, and you see the social psychologist in me is relentless there, that it still focuses us on each and every person taken separately. And actually, to anticipate a bit, one of the cultural images that I often associate with this is the image of the cubicle and cubicle culture, right? We give awards or we try to discover creativity at this very individual level. And the problem with this is also that we place responsibility for one's creativity only on the person. That's why you have, for example, such great levels of creative burnout in the creative industries, because people take on this idea that it is my creativity. And if I fail, then it is my fault, it's my shortcoming, right? So we need new ways, I would say, to think about this. And another big contributor to this paradigm is psychometrics, so testing. Nowadays in psychology, we can test for creativity. Happy to talk more about that and critique this idea with you. I'm not going to talk about testing much, but if you're interested, happy to answer that later. So probably by now you thought, okay, Vlad doesn't like the he paradigm or the I paradigm, he must like something. And indeed, I am a big fan and supporter of what I call the we paradigm, which is, again, not taking away the creator, but trying to place the creative person in their context. And this context is very wide. It goes from the life trajectory of the person to the materials and spaces and culture we live in, to the objects we use and the technologies we use. And I'm not going to say a lot about technology and AI, as I know we'll have a second keynote on that. But basically, according to the we paradigm, creativity is a relational phenomenon. It is grounded not only in isolated minds, but in the connection between minds, in all these acts of collaboration, of perspective taking, of just making things, And the quite provocative claim, if you go down the line of this path of the we paradigm, is that everything actually is co-created. Even things we do in isolation, and I'd be curious if you're with me on that one, they build on ideas that came from talking to other people. Think about Google Scholar. I think it still has as a motto, standing on the shoulders of giants. Think about what we do right now. I mean, the words I'm saying, maybe they have some element of novelty, hopefully some element of novelty for you, but I did not invent the language I'm talking, right? And we didn't invent necessarily the language we're speaking. So there is an element of participation of other people in every act of creativity, and this is what the we paradigm tries to make transparent, the invisible network of collaboration. Now, I don't know if you know where this monument is. Do you know? Does anyone know? Sorry? Not Istanbul. I heard In Lisbon, exactly. You know, we're thrown off by the bridge. So Istanbul and San Francisco are... now, let me tell you, this monument got a lot of heat because, of course, there are some colonial undertones there. But for the moment, I'm just going to talk about the architecture itself, which is, when I saw it, I was a PhD student walking through Lisbon, and I was so surprised to see one monument that doesn't only have the person on top or just one bust, you know, but it kind of makes visible again the other people who contribute to the discovery, in that case, the monument of discovery. Now, these are all men at the back, and yeah, we go back to the key paradigm, but these are merchants and painters, and, you know, how would it be to celebrate or to think about creativity in terms of the network? What is our network? What is our environment? What is our system? So this is what the we paradigm proposes. And if I brought you with me on this, I think one of the first takeaways, I would say, when we work with other people or ourselves, and we ask ourselves, am I creative, is to question some of the myths around creativity. And I call them myths, again, other people might disagree with that, but this idea that it only comes from ourselves, from within ourselves, I find it quite problematic at times, or the idea that, you know, other people are there just to kind of harm my creativity or hinder me. And I think there are so many ways in which we collaborate with others, and we should allow ourselves to be immersed within this wider environment. So how do we do it? And this is where I go to the creative process. Now, you'll see my graphic visual abilities are minimal, so this is the best I can do there. But how do we actually create? I told you a story about big ways of thinking about creativity as a process, but how do we do it? So let's take this bubble, okay? This bubble could be anything. It could be a problem, it could be an object, it could be even ourselves. You know, we have creative identities that we work on. But in the spirit of making it simpler, let's put an umbrella. I think we're all very familiar with umbrellas, and it will help me make the point. So, as we approach the objects, issues, people, events in our life, we often do so from particular positions, right? We are positioned in our world physically, like look at us now. We here, you know, we have a particular perspective, a visual perspective on the room, and you would have your own unique perspective on the room that I don't have access to. So the mere act of being physically positioned gives us a unique perspective. But we are positioned in many other ways. We're positioned socially as well. We have different roles. We can be doctor and patient, or parent and child, and so on, right? And this gives us a different perspective into the situation. When parents and kids, and I would know that very well, go into a toy store, they look for very different things, I can tell you that. So they have a very different positioning and perspective and way of understanding what makes a good toy or educational toy and so on. So we are rooted in positions and perspectives, and this kind of makes the world familiar to us. So if we ask ourselves, what is an umbrella? Some of the most common ways of positioning ourselves tell us that, well, it is something that shelters us from the rain. Interestingly enough, if we are born, for example, in Southeast Asia or in other spaces, you might have seen the umbrella looks quite differently and oftentimes actually shelters people from the sun. So already you see this big geographical shift or cultural shift will give us maybe something new as a dominant perspective on the umbrella. The story of creativity and the story of possibility in many ways starts when we acknowledge another position or another perspective. There is a space of difference, there is a space of tension between how we usually think about things, how most people would think about things, and this other way of thinking. Okay? To give you an example, and I wish I had taken this photo myself, I just Googled for it, but you can find potentially umbrellas as lamps, right? This is quite intriguing. I would love to have that in my house. Well, obviously I would use it in lectures, but you see, it's kind of a reversal of what the umbrella is. We usually think of things coming from the top, and now it's kind of spreading light from the bottom. It's using different affordances. And I think if we are to see this at a dinner party or, you know, in a designer studio, we would get into this frame of mind or state of mind where we start questioning, what is an umbrella? We start defamiliarizing a little bit what we assume the umbrella is. And we start looking for the dotted line. What else is there? clearly it's not just an umbrella. You know, it's almost like a Magritte situation, ce n'est pas une pipe. Every object, everything in reality doesn't have just one interpretation or one value or one meaning. And the moment we tap into that, we get to explore. Now, I've explored online. Again, I like Googling for things, and I found that, you know, you can pot flowers in your umbrellas. I, again, could do that. This I couldn't do. You can make skirts, very useful. Not today, but you never know. Or you can deconstruct it and create like a magazine stand, right? So, to recap, the way I tend to look at the creative process is this. We are creative because we have this human, I would say, and I'm not being speciesist here. I think there are many animals or some animals who can also play this game of perspectives. We're not trapped within singular positions in the world. We have a multiplicity of positions. You know, think about growing up and the different identities we have. Think about our life experience. Each one of us can do this dialogue of perspectives with ourselves. Imagine when we meet other people and we actually engage with their actual position in that situation. So very often, to be creative means to acknowledge this diversity of perspectives, of ways of thinking about and doing things with whatever we talk about, and then being open to the emergence of something new. Because if things are not meant to be fundamentally A or B, then there is room to create. There is room to imagine new things, right? The third perspective. So for me, I like to think of creativity very much as a dialogue of perspectives, this idea of putting points of view together and reflecting, okay, if I think that and you think that, what does it actually mean? Is there a third space? Is there a new perspective that can come out? The way I like to also, I love these metaphors, is to think about it as the blind man and the elephant. You probably obviously know this parable. It's the idea that if you're blind and you touch only one part of the elephant, if you touch only the leg, you're going to think maybe it's a tree. If you touch the tail, maybe it's a snake. If you touch the tusk, maybe it's an arm, very cold arm. Anyway, the idea is that if you're trapped into a singular position, a singular way of doing things, you will never get to see the elephant. And how did these blind men potentially get to discover the elephant is by talking, by moving around, by doing things, right? This is the we paradigm I was telling you about. It's not all in the head. We need to move around, we need to exchange positions, we need to become other, and we need to talk to other people, so therefore a bigger picture emerges. And this story that I'm telling you here, and again, many of you work with children, and you would be very familiar with it, this has a deep developmental root and a big developmental history to it. Because a lot of people think that creativity, and rightfully so, emerges in pretend play. And I think the word play is also in the title of the conference. So what do children do when they play? They take up different roles. These seem to be quite privileged in having costumes that go with them. But every kind of child, when they say, let's pretend I'm police and you're the thief, or, every child would do this, would take these different roles, and then they would play out a perspective. They would try to understand, what would a grocery store owner say to the person coming to buy things, and then they would exchange that perspective. They would try to kind of move around so they see how it feels to be in the position of someone else, right? And that's where a lot of creativity comes from. Think about the most basic type of children's play that is actually extremely complex. It's hide and seek. If you've been around again, and we have a 6, 4, and 2-year-old at home, so I could do a study on this, but you notice at different ages how children play hide and seek, and it is quite hilarious. I mean, you know what I'm talking about. They sometimes hide their eyes, they sometimes hide their head, right? There is an effort, theory of mind, we say in psychology, to understand how other people might see your body, even if you don't see them, right? So an effort of understanding others. But the moment you do, children and adults who are really good at this game, hide and seek, are those who can really think about the world through the lens of the other. To be a great person who hides, you need to think with the mind of the seeker, and the other way around, right? So these ideas of exchanging position, of adopting a new perspective, they're fundamental. We do it when we play, we do it in conversations, when we listen and we stop talking because we see the other person wants to start talking. It's a very fundamental human thing to do, and it has a lot of potential for creativity. But you might ask me, okay, Vlad, if this is so fundamental, we do it every moment, I'm doing it right now, sitting and listening to you, and you certainly are, because you have your own perspective and you listen to my perspective, then why isn't creativity absolutely everywhere, flourishing, and everybody's going around, high on creativity? Well, in some ways, yes, there are micro moments of creativity that we can discover and celebrate. But I think if we embrace this idea of the we paradigm, of the dialogue of perspectives, we have to ask ourselves new key questions. And I'm calling them new because if some of you are familiar with the work on creativity, there is a big literature. Oftentimes we use a different vocabulary. We talk about divergent thinking, combinatorial, associations and of ideas, and I'm not against any of that. But if you adopt this other way of thinking about it, I think the key questions are these. First of all, how do we become aware of new perspectives? This is actually a harder thing than it sounds because, again, without oversimplifying, our cognitive apparatus, if you want, is very much geared towards familiarity and sameness. We feel comfort when things are similar and the same as we are. Think about your Facebook feed or social media feed, if you've ever curated it so that, we don't get too many of those problematic views that would challenge us and annoy us many times, right? We also tend to like people who are more like us and so on and so forth. So actually there is a real effort to engage with different perspectives, and especially perspectives that we don't expect or we might not agree with. The second question is, okay, I'm aware that you think differently or someone on social media thinks differently and mildly annoyed at it perhaps and so on. What do we do with that? Is it enough to just be aware? No, I would argue that we need to understand to value, and I'm using deliberately the word care here, to care about this diversity of perspectives. Now, I'm going to make a very clear statement. To value or care doesn't mean to agree with this perspective. This is fundamental to me. So we live in a very polarized world. We all know about that. And I'm sure many of us wouldn't feel comfortable talking to a climate change denial or skeptic person or, anti-vax people, assuming. And the way I see creativity, it shouldn't be, well, we're going to talk to them and kind of agree with them. And it's about understanding the logic of where they come from. It's trying to understand what is the positioning that makes them think the way they think. Because in discovering that, we're going to get more creative possibilities to actually engage with them, right? So this is what, for me, it means to value or care, is to try to understand that things come from somewhere, and trying to understand that is important for our own creative process. And the last part is, what do we do with all of this? So we can feel very enlightened and very happy with ourselves. I'm always listening, I'm very open-minded, all of that. But we need to also have strategies to engage with these differences of perspective and to do something, to use them to expand possibilities. So in the last 15 minutes, I'm quite good with time, surprisingly, I'm going to take you through some methods that I'm using and my colleagues are using, and colleagues from the center, but many other people working with creativity innovation. And I'm going to group them, and this is not an exhaustive list by any means at all. I'm going to group them under these big headings of the questions: encountering new perspectives, valuing them, and acting on them. So a few methods that I often use to stimulate new perspectives. One of them is quite classic, and if it's good and tried and tested, why not use it? Brainstorming. Now, brainstorming, if you do scientific research on the use of brainstorming, you'll notice that sometimes it works less well than we imagine. I'm not going to get into that debate. This is not about being the most productive, but the spirit of brainstorming, if you've ever been through a session of brainstorming, is voicing new things without being judged or evaluated immediately on them. And that is hugely liberating. If we can achieve that atmosphere, it's fantastic. How do we achieve it? Well, in brainstorming, people tell you, it's okay to say whatever you think, but do we believe them? Very often we don't. So you need extra ways of doing it. Playfulness and humor can be some of these ways. Another thing that I like to use when I apply this method is called the worst idea method. Now, in brainstorming, you're not asked to put out bad ideas, but some ideas will be kind of odd or bad in that way. How about we get through those first? How about we make it a competition of voicing the worst idea possible at the beginning? I promise you it would change the dynamic immediately. And this is not about the idea itself. It's about trying to create this space, widening it and trying to make it comfortable for people and kind of psychologically safe to say things that are odd or, bad in that way. And sometimes people who use this worst idea method actually, they take those ideas and they start questioning, why is it actually a bad idea? And then they get to figure out what are our deep assumptions about what we do. And sometimes actually a bad idea might not be that bad, or it might lead to a good idea. So that's the way they use it. So encountering new perspectives, we need to talk to people, but we need to also create that atmosphere of safety and trust, psychological trust, that we can be ourselves, if you want to use a phrase, or we can allow ourselves not to know. The second thing is failure. I mean, that connects very much with this. One of the biggest, if you ask me, the top kind of obstacle to being creative, innovative, or playful is the way we've been taught from very early on, and I think schooling has a lot to do with that, and I know many things are changing, but this idea that to be right means that you are worthy, you are a good person if you are right and if you know. Okay? If you make something, if you make a mistake, if you fail, that is bad. And that will reflect on you, and people will think about you differently. And you know what? It depends on the nature of the failure. If you do a catastrophic failure, yeah, we can talk. But there are methods, they're called fast and intelligent failure, where you ask people to do something and to deliberately try to make mistakes so that they learn from them. One of the classical things here, and some of you might have used that, is to give young people, or anybody really, macaroni sticks or popsicle type of, sticks, and ask them to create the biggest construction they can in the, and it should stand on its own. And what these kind of exercises show, and this is a big value to people doing them, is that if you stand back and only think conceptually about what you could do, you might come up with a good solution, but the people who often do the best are those who immediately get on and start doing things, and it falls down and it breaks down and they learn and they do something new. It's trial and error. Failure has a huge part to play in how we create. So I think creating, again, an atmosphere and understanding that it is okay to be wrong or to fail, hugely important. And finally for my short list here, the idea of problem reformulation. A lot of people think of creativity innovation as problem solving, and problem solving is crucial. We need to solve problems. But actually, the focus and the work is in finding and defining the problem and redefining the problem. Because a lot of the solutions we come up with actually depend on how we frame the problem in the first place. There is, again, research done on changing the framing completely changes your perspective on what the problem is. So one of my colleagues talks about having mice in your basement, right? If you tell somebody I have mice in my basement, very often in the way we frame it, it's going to be, okay, call somebody, take poison, take everybody out, whatever. But maybe you can create a little circus for those mice and do, you can make a little museum. Who knows, right? So there are ways to formulate, like, is that an opportunity for me for I can raise, mice for labs. Probably I wouldn't. But anyway, the idea, you see what I mean? The way we frame that problem, my problem is I'm disgusted and terrorized, I have mice in my basement, will lead you to a solution path, which might be okay, it might be the solution to have. But if you want to engage with new perspectives, you need to give yourself that time to kind of put the problem differently. One practical technique that I use with my students when we do this is they make a problem statement. Okay, what is your problem? And they put it in a sentence or 2 sentences, brief. And then I ask them, I would like you to restate that problem without using any of the words of your initial formulation. You can use the and whatever, right? I'm not that brutal. But if you take away, and you'll have to use synonyms, you'll have maybe to formulate it in a very different way. And very often there is a very new insight that comes about just from doing this basic exercise. Okay, valuing or caring for new perspectives. One of the big ways that I work with creativity, and you probably saw that with my positions, perspectives, and so on, is with the idea of role play. Role play and kind of dramaturgical theater type methods is so fundamental for a lot of my work with creativity, and I think your work with social care. This idea of how do you embody the experience of another person? And there are many traps along the way. I think people can engage in very stereotypical role plays. If you tell someone, okay, you're a clown, and they're going to go for the red nose, which is fine, But there is so much more to being a clown than maybe the red nose. So giving people time to understand the roles that they have to engage with is also fundamental, right? Sometimes it's exchanging the role, working with someone and becoming them and they become you. You know, sometimes we do that when we tell people you present the other person and they present you. I mean, there's so many ways to get a new idea, a new understanding of the other through role play. There are also more structured methods around that. So you might have heard about the personas method, which basically invites people to have like a background story for the people, the users, the clients, whoever they work with, that they get to role play. So it's not just be a clown, be a magician, but I'm reading something about a concrete person and then I'm getting into role play, right? So that's, to me, is always very, very efficient. Another big concept that I work with is this idea of wonder. And wonder is a fascinating phenomenon. I absolutely love it. I have a book on wonder, happy to share it with you. And wonder goes back to not knowing, you know, having this intellectual humility of accepting that there are many things in life that you really don't know about. And other people and the minds of others will always be a space of novelty to us, including to ourselves, by the way. We often surprise ourselves. But this idea that I'm looking at the other with eyes of wonder and genuine curiosity, and I don't try immediately to box people or to box experiences and think that there is always more that I do not know about them, is hugely transformative. So how do we do that? Well, there are different techniques. One of them is through questioning, right? So wonder works a lot with questions, and we have different types of questions. Often the why question is very powerful, the why and the what for, because it takes us to motivation. It takes us to the background, to the assumptions we have. So working with deep level questions, especially about other people and their experience, can be very useful. And you can actually unite, obviously, some of these exercises. So for example, you can start with a wondering type of exercise before going into role play, so that you kind of worked through, you know, the bigger picture of that person or that role. And it's all tied together in a way by storytelling. Storytelling is, again, a very familiar method that I use a lot. I'm sure you use a lot in different ways. Even if we don't have the time with a person or with a group to make up a whole story, you know, by the way, there are ways like flash fiction and things that make very small stories, and we can work with that as well. We tell our experience in terms of stories. A lot of our creativity comes from the story we tell. Of particular interest to me are autobiographical stories, so life stories. Telling people or asking them to tell you their life story is an amazingly interesting, I mean, you don't have to be a creativity researcher, it's a very interesting exercise. But then thinking with them, exactly in the spirit of that first model I showed you about what could have been, what else is to come, thinking about a life course as moments of rupture and transition, and trying to understand what helps us, what kind of story did we tell ourselves that moved us to a next stage? What other story could we have told ourselves? So what other story can we tell ourselves now to move forward? So being creative with storytelling is, again, foundational. I found, you know, if you are in the kind of, the aim is to relax people and have them work with you, telling them we're going to play, you know, it's a play exercise, sometimes has that effect, or starting people with this very storytelling type of formula, once upon a time. You know, once upon a time, and then you kind of tap into that, well, childhood probably experience of allowing yourself to say something unique after that, right? It'd be quite boring to say once upon a time we were all sitting here at tables. Probably you're going to go a bit further. Another method that I like to use with storytelling is kind of co-creating a story. So I don't know if you used that before, but language is such a fantastic tool for creativity. I ask people to go around adding one sentence to a story that we make. And that is, you know, again, you need a lot of trust, because you can't really prepare for that, because by the time the story comes to you, you don't know what the previous sentence was. So there is an element of vulnerability of putting yourself out there. But seeing a story being put together by different people, it's again a very transformative exercise. It often comes up with very unexpected new things. To learn a lot about than others. It's all about kind of perspectives and understand that of those perspectives. Now, what do we do with this? We practically on different new perspectives. Well, one of the things, and it's not you, is actually making sense. A lot of times when we have creativity, we creative ideation. The light bulb is one of the mental, yes, even a light bulb, yes, on slides. It's a mental way, pragmatic way of thinking of creativity. But interesting as it is, it buys the way we think about it, because light bulb is the moment, right? It's the moment of insight. Oh, I got the idea. But there's much work done before that and so much done after. We become blind to that. Work actually to do with people making things. One of the things that I do whenever I can, the problem, there is something to give people medals, and can you make a structure or something that reflects that problem, or the insights that you got, or the relationship you're working on. Make it in another medium, make it in a physical form. Sometimes I kind of borrow my kids' toys to do that. I don't tell them. But you can also go and take these objects. You can branches and stones and materials are absolutely everywhere. And ask people to make things, to give them an embodied form. And that will most of the times in my experience gives you the possibility to get a new idea and to kind of do things differently in that moment. Not to mention that a lot of companies are, very much waking up when it comes to this, and you have things like Lego. I'm sure you know they have a series called Serious Play that they sell to other companies, and people playing together and making stuff can be big business as well. Doesn't always have to be. We don't need only Legos for that. Another thing is to validate the experience of the people you talk to, the users of different things, maybe things that you bring to a situation, technologies or objects or ideas, and to ask them, what would you do with that? So a big driver of creativity innovation in society is user innovation. And again, going back to companies, and actually to Lego, if I'm to continue this, one of the keys behind their success, and there are many, is the fact that they freely give Lego sets to teachers and classrooms, and they work with a huge network of schools. And then they ask back for photos and stories of how these bricks are being actually used. So being open-minded to the agency and the power of people in front of you to define what it is that you're giving them, and to listen to them, and to listen back to, okay, what is actually useful that I didn't know in the thing that I'm proposing here, is another big engine of creativity. And last but not least, I added improvisation here, and some of you might be more familiar than others with this. Improvisation is very wide. You can combine it obviously with role play, you can combine it even with making and other things, but the rule of improvisation is this idea of yes and, right? Is this openness, going back to the main theme for me today, this openness to what the other gives you and trying to build together something. And there is something about a genuine act of improvisation that is really transforming the self, because you get to be so attuned to another person, but at the same time you get to let go a little bit of yourself in the act of improvisation. So you can do improvisation with storytelling, as I was saying, kind of adding the sentence to a story. You can do improvisation obviously with music, with theater, with many, many things. But it's this attitude of being open to what might happen next, and being open to the contribution of others into what might happen next. So, a final word of hope, hopefully, on bureaucracy. I know the theme of the conference and the context is this high regulation, maybe for some over-regulation of different professions. I know about the regulation around my profession. We're not going to go into those. We're on camera. But obviously it creates a context in which we might think, well, that was the death of creativity. That's, possibilities are gone. At least we would feel that there is a restriction in that. And I'm hoping that everything I told you, the we paradigm, the creative identity part, creativity in the everyday, the way we adopt new perspectives, wakes us up to the fact that creativity will always be there. That no matter how much regulation we bring to something, and actually sometimes in response to that regulation, we actually harness or get an even more creative response. Because regulations can never fully determine, maybe I'm overly optimistic in the age of AI, but be with me, can never fully determine human behavior. There will always be a space of possibility around that. And a lot of that possibility is in how we look at ourselves and how we look at others. That's so foundational. And I know I'm preaching to the choir and to the converted here, because you know much better than many other professions about the value of caring and listening to others. But that is such a huge engine of creativity. So that is kind of part of my message, is to not only celebrate, but connect to that as a starting point for more of this improvisation and playfulness and creating spaces of difference that help us truly, develop this careful reimagining of ourselves, of others, and society in the face of, and even because of, regulation and bureaucracy. Creativity comes out of constraints. Everybody who says, I'm going to think outside the box, I will tell you, there is always a kind of box there. Even the box of language, of the things, The question is, are we trapped by a single box? Or do we see many boxes, expand our box, move between boxes? And that's a way to work in a way with regulations as well. There will be always multiple regulations, and there will be a space of application that will never be fully determined. Or at least that's my hope. And that's my hope because I work on possibility studies, and that maybe gives me this kind of biased, but hopefully useful way of looking at the world. And if you're interested to know more, we do have a network, we have a journal, an encyclopedia, many things I'm very happy to share with you if you want. But we also have actually an annual conference as well. The next edition will be in Maynooth. The last one was hosted by Cambridge University. And if ever you're free, early July, you're going to hear much more from people who work on agency and play and counterfactuals and all the rest. So thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Vlad. Just before we ask questions from the floor, can you maybe talk about the barriers that you see for creativity and maybe your thoughts on how to overcome them?
Right. Well, do we have another hour, right? The barriers, as I said, for me, this will sound as if we need to develop some kind of activism to fight a lot of things that are happening institutionally that might not be okay, and that is part of being creative. But I think a lot of barriers are almost internal in the way we and other people think about our own creativity. So I would always ask people to start from that point. What are my assumptions about what it means to be creative? What is it that I'm thinking this is more creative and why? It's a very useful exercise. The other thing is about not knowing failure and risk-taking and all of these social image kind of barriers that we have very often. And again, it's normal to have them. We don't want to go through the world bumping into people and destroying things. But I think just being mindful of how to create a space of trust and psychological safety would take us a very, very long way. And another thing is the power of collaboration. A lot of people tell me, and I'm with that, I get my best ideas when I'm alone, right? Sometimes, and I'm sure it's your experience, many of you, I need to kind of go away for a moment and think with my own head. Absolutely fine. This is not contradicting, I would say, anything about the re-paradigm, because being alone is not a asocial state of mind, right? You still work with the perspectives of others. So I think opening the minds of people towards the value of collaboration at this deeper level, not only collaborating with person X or Y, but what does it mean to be in contact and to really try to understand other people would be a huge driver as well of creativity. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, Vlad. You mentioned something that just stuck in my mind. You used the word, you identified yourself as a pragmatist,
Yeah.
as well as, obviously, you're a really creative person. And sometimes I feel I'm meeting people that they think there's a conflict between the creative person and the pragmatist.
Right.
So could you say more about the pragmatist and the creative in one?
Absolutely. Pragmatists, we can take in different ways. A lot of the work I do, I put under the philosophical label of pragmatism, which is this philosophy of consequence. I'm looking at the consequence of things, and that's why I'm interested in what does it do to think of creativity in this way or that way? What is the consequence? So that's part of looking at it. But being pragmatic for most people means making do with what they have, not doing anything too radical so that they help things go on. And I think here we need to go back a bit to the definition of creativity, right? It had novelty and originality, but it also had value and appropriateness. I think the pragmatic end is a bit of that meaningfulness of things, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. In Western cultures, we're often kind of biased towards novelty, and actually we hear a lot about the disruptive tech and disruptive innovation, creative destruction, and sadly a lot of it, if it's taken to the extreme, is taking us to quite dangerous places in terms of the environment, society, and so on. I'm not going to get into details. But I'm a believer in the fact that if we kind of think of the meaningfulness of things as a criterion, as people actually do in other cultural spaces, more Eastern, more Southern, Global South, where to create means to build community as well. To create means to kind of build bonds, not only to make something completely new and different. I think we would at least expand our possibilities. So I say we should recover the notion of pragmatist and a creative pragmatist, but of course add to it maybe some of these techniques, because we can always do a little bit more with our creativity. So I'm not going to say stop there, but I'm going to say there is a positive thing in being a pragmatist. So yeah, I recommend it. Thanks. Yeah, there is.
I just ask you about the question of making things. I was
Yeah.
interested in that idea of Lego or taking things from nature and making things in response to some kind of a difficulty or problem. And I know in our own college in EJOP and other places have what's called maker spaces now.
Right.
So I'd like just to think about how social care might use those things. So
Yeah.
sometimes we have social care students. They're just beginning now. They're knocking at the door of the maker space, looking
Exactly.
at thinking, what's that got to do with us? That must be to do with computing.
Yeah,
and then begin
absolutely.
to think about how they can make something.
Absolutely, it's a great question, and people, some are fortunate to have a designated maker space, but I'm going to give you some good news. We can create maker spaces. In some ways, actually, we might be trapped by the idea that the maker space is where creative things happen, and the moment we get out, we become the pragmatists or the bureaucrats, and I think it's the philosophy of a maker space that is the most interesting, and the philosophy of that, I mean, there are many things, but it's trial and error. And this idea of playfulness in many ways, again, back to the title of the conference. So we don't have, I don't have a particular makerspace that is hyper-technological, but we use a lot of found objects, or for me, a lot of it is in the questions we ask and the tasks we do, and the takeaway from those instead of just having the latest technology. And I know you didn't mean that, but I think a lot of people, when they think of makerspaces, they think of VR, and they think of, which can be fantastic, but you can have a lot of tech and not do anything very creative with it. So maybe I'm old school in that, but because of this idea of wonder, I think of the value of the right task or the right question. So some of the things I told you about with role play, with the bad idea, there are ways to kind of build up a context for it. At the end of the day, I think whether we have a makerspace or not, it's not about being creative now with this one idea in this moment. It's about the culture of creativity. So having a makerspace is a great sign that people are thinking about it and they value it. But more than that is, how do we take the atmosphere of a makerspace and put it into other interactions, outside of it? So I think that is crucial. But it's certainly a good thing. So I'm a big fan, and I'm a big fan of thinking creatively about makerspaces. This is very much could be and will be a makerspace for us, maybe beyond the conference. Thanks.
Hello, Vlad. I just had a question about research. There's a real absence of research in this, support for research in this whole area, particularly in social care. Do you have any suggestions about concrete actions that can be taken?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. Thank you for asking. I'm directing now a new research